October 19th, 2025. Thieves walked into the Louvre and stole artifacts from Napoleon's collection. Security was shocked. Historians clutched their pearls. But here's the real joke. Those treasures were already stolen. The difference? The original thieves thought they were saviors. Tonight's tale isn't about a simple villain or a pure hero. It's about a man who genuinely believed he was rescuing civilization while systematically looting it. Napoleon didn't think he was stealing Europe's heritage. He thought he was liberating it. That's infinitely more dangerous than ordinary greed. Here's what they won't tell you in the patriotic French version, or the outraged Italian one. Napoleon's museum project was both revolutionary and robbery. It genuinely democratized art access, while destroying national heritage. It preserved masterpieces through conquest. The Louvre became the world's first great public museum, and all it cost was everything beautiful Europe had created for 1,000 years. Was he history's greatest art thief or civilization's greatest curator? Yes, both, and he died believing he'd been the hero. If you enjoy history that refuses to choose between hero worship and villain caricature, where the truth lives in the uncomfortable middle, consider subscribing. Now settle in, let the weight of the day fall away. Tonight, we're following a true believer build his dream on stolen foundations, convinced until his dying breath that the end justified the means. To understand how a man convinces himself that looting is liberation, we need to go back to where it started, to a poor Corsican boy standing outside the locked doors of France's art collections. Napoleon Bonaparte grew up poor in every way that mattered to 18th century France. His family had a title, minor Corsican nobility, but in the glittering salons of Paris, he was a joke, short, awkward, speaking French with an accent the aristocrats mocked. And when he tried to visit their precious private art collections, the doors stayed closed. Picture it, 1784, a gangly 15-year-old cadet at the École Militaire. His classmates, sons of dukes and counts, spoke of weekends in family galleries, of Raphaels hanging in their dining rooms. Napoleon had grown up with whitewashed walls and his mother's desperate economies. When he asked to join a visit to the Duke of Orleans' collection, the silence that followed taught him everything about his place in their world. The rejection stung with a particular venom that would never leave his bloodstream. These boys who'd never earned anything possessed beauty he could only glimpse through half-open doors. They hoarded masterpieces like private jokes, and Napoleon Bonaparte of Ajaccio was decidedly unworthy. But something else burned in that rejection. The conviction that they were wrong. Wrong to lock beauty away. Wrong to make art a privilege of birth. Wrong to treat humanity's greatest achievements as private property. If art was civilization's highest achievement, shouldn't it belong to everyone? And if the aristocrats wouldn't share it willingly? Well, the Rome he read about obsessed him, not the corrupt papal state of his present, but the ancient republic, when public buildings rivaled palaces, when citizens could walk among statues, when libraries opened to any Roman who could read. That was civilization. Everything since was decline, corruption, the hoarding of beauty by the unworthy. Years later, when his armies would strip Venice of its bronze horses, Napoleon would remember that 15-year-old boy standing outside a duke's door. He'd remember the guard's polite smile that said, "You don't belong here." But he didn't just want in. He wanted to tear down the doors entirely, not to destroy the beauty inside, but to drag it into the sunlight where everyone could see it. This wasn't simple revenge. This was transformation. He would remake the entire concept of who deserved beauty. The aristocrats had taught him that art was power. They just hadn't realized he was such an excellent student. The path from humiliation to empire often runs through other people's treasures. Napoleon would pave his with masterpieces, convinced he was saving civilization, and when he needed someone to execute this vision, He found the perfect accomplice. Dominique Vivant Denon was 60 years old when he met Napoleon in 1797, and he'd already lived 3 lives: courtier to Louis XV, survivor of the Terror, and always a man who loved beauty more than breathing. He carried notebooks, decades of observations about which Italian churches held Caravaggios, which German princes hoarded Roman antiquities, which Spanish monasteries concealed Moorish treasures. Denon had spent 40 years as a guest in these places, sketching, admiring, secretly cataloguing. He knew where Europe hid its beauty. The meeting happened in Milan, in a palazzo Napoleon had requisitioned. Denon walked through rooms he'd visited as a diplomat 20 years earlier, now belonging to France. Progress always came with a little dirt. Napoleon leafed through the notebooks with the intensity of a general studying battle plans. Each sketch represented a future acquisition. Each notation marked a target. His questions were precise. How many men to move the Locoon? Could the bronze horses survive transport? Which Vatican treasures were most essential? Denon found himself speaking faster, gesturing with hands that had once kissed royal rings. He talked about centralization serving scholarship. How could anyone study Renaissance painting when works were scattered across hundreds of collections? He spoke of preservation, masterpieces rotting in damp chapels, blackening under candle smoke. Napoleon listened, then spoke his vision. A museum for all humanity, free to the public, open to anyone who wanted to learn. The greatest works gathered in one place, protected and preserved for all time. It was everything Denon had dreamed of. It was also theft on a scale that would have made Caesar blush. But sitting in that stolen palazzo, the distinction seemed academic. History was written by victors. Museums were built by whoever had the biggest army. The Egyptian campaign solidified their partnership. At 51, Denon crossed deserts, sketched temples half buried in sand, climbed inside pyramids by torchlight. He sent back crates of antiquities, each carefully documented. This wasn't looting, he told himself. This was preservation. In Paris, they would be studied, cherished, displayed for millions. The logic was seductive because it was partially true, but Denon was old enough to recognize the bitter taste of a rationalization. He swallowed it anyway. Some pills are easier to take when you're convinced you're saving the world. The Egyptian campaign of 1798 solidified their partnership in ways that would define everything that followed. Napoleon invaded Egypt with 167 scholars, and Denon was among them. At 51 years old, he crossed deserts that would have killed younger men. His aging body pushed to its limits by heat and disease that ravaged the French forces. But while Napoleon's soldiers died of thirst and dysentery, Denon sketched temples half buried in sand, documenting hieroglyphs no European had properly studied. He climbed inside pyramids by torchlight, his hands steady despite the darkness and the weight of 3,000 years pressing down from above. The tombs were suffocating, thick with ancient dust and the smell of death. But Denon filled notebook after notebook with drawings, measurements, observations. This was what he'd been born to do, to witness, to document, to preserve. The Rosetta Stone's discovery became legend, but Denon's contribution was documenting it first. He sketched the trilingual text before anyone fully understood its significance, recognizing that this granite slab might unlock millennia of silence. When British forces defeated the French and claimed Egypt's treasures as spoils of war, Denon's drawings remained. The stone went to London, but its secrets had already been copied. Back in Paris, Denon's Egyptian notebooks became the foundation of Description de l'Égypte, the massive scholarly work that introduced Europe to pharaonic civilization. 20 years of publication, thousands of illustrations, all built on what Denon had witnessed and drawn during that brutal campaign. Was it scholarship or colonialism? Both, always both. Denon documented a civilization Europeans had ignored for centuries, while Napoleon's armies plundered it. But here's where the story gets complicated in that particularly Napoleonic way. Some of what Denon documented was genuinely at risk. Local authorities used temples as quarries, pulled down ancient structures for building stone. European collectors were already stripping sites, just less systematically. The French at least pretended to scholarly purpose. Denon convinced himself this made a difference. Years later, when asked about Egypt, Denon would grow defensive. He'd built his life on a premise that was crumbling even as he stated it, that preservation through conquest was still preservation, that documenting while stealing was better than simply stealing, that if someone was going to loot Egypt, at least they'd done it with notebooks and good intentions. It was the rationalization of an old man who'd given his best years to something that might have been a crime. And yet, without Denon's documentation, so much would have been lost forever. The temples he sketched were later destroyed. The artifacts he catalogued disappeared into private collections or were ground to dust. His scholarly work genuinely advanced human understanding. So what do we call him? Thief? Scholar? Both? Neither? Denon died in 1825 without resolving this question. And perhaps it was never meant to be resolved. Some contradictions don't have answers, just consequences. The machinery of cultural conquest began to turn with military efficiency. By 1796, French armies carried more than weapons. They carried lists, detailed, methodical lists drawn up by Denon and his team. The Commission of Sciences and Arts became the most educated band of thieves in history. Art historians, archaeologists, scientists, men who could identify a Caravaggio in candlelight and calculate exactly how much weight a wagon axle could bear. The scene repeated itself across Italy. French cavalry would thunder through ancient gates, and then, while cities still smoked, men in civilian clothes appeared with notebooks and careful hands, speaking perfect Italian, expressing deep appreciation while they stripped it bare. Venice fell in 1797, and the bronze horses of St. Mark's became the symbol of systematic plunder. These magnificent creatures had stood watch over the city for 500 years, themselves stolen from Constantinople centuries earlier. Now French engineers built scaffolding, calculating weight distributions, arguing about the best way to lower 2,000-year-old bronze without damage. The horses came down on a grey December morning. Fog rolled in from the lagoon, muffling sound, turning the whole scene dreamlike. Venetians gathered in silence as their city's symbols were wrapped in French canvas. An old curator stood in the crowd, tears running down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. Denon supervised personally, his hand steady despite the December cold. He spoke to the horses as they descended, murmuring reassurances. They would be safe in Paris. They would be displayed properly, studied properly, loved properly. No more sea air eating at their bronze. The curator in the crowd said something in Venetian dialect that Denon chose not to understand. Sometimes not speaking the local language was a mercy. The Treaty of Tolentino showed how thoroughly Napoleon had weaponized culture. Pope Pius VI faced a choice: surrender 100 of the Vatican's greatest treasures or watch French armies sack Rome. The Holy Father chose his treasure's departure over his city's destruction. He signed away Raphaels and Caravaggios like a man signing his own death warrant. The selection process was educated brutality. Denon and his experts walked through the Vatican like shoppers at a market, pointing at masterpieces with the casual authority of conquerors. That Raphael? Essential. This Caravaggio? We'll take it. The ancient Roman statues in the Belvedere? Pack them all. Vatican curators followed behind, whispering prayers or curses. They watched French soldiers wrap the Laocoon, the magnificent ancient sculpture of a father and sons dying in serpent's embrace. 2,000 years old, discovered in Roman ruins, preserved by popes, now headed for Paris in a wagon built for cannons. The convoys moved slowly, protected like royal processions. Rain meant stops. Rocky roads meant detours. The journey from Rome to Paris could take months. Dinon often travelled with these convoys, checking wrappings each morning, refusing to leave until certain nothing had shifted. The arrivals in Paris became events. Crowds gathered to watch wagons roll through streets, their contents announced by criers. From the Vatican Palace, the Apollo Belvedere, from Venice, the horses of St. Mark. Parisians cheered each arrival like military victories, which, in a way, they were. The Louvre transformed to accommodate its new residents. Walls came down to create vast galleries. The former royal palace became a construction site of marble dust and ambition, and the democratic promise seemed to be working. On opening days, Parisians flooded in, not just the educated elite, but working people who'd never seen a painting that wasn't a shop sign. A washerwoman could stand before the same Raphael that had decorated a pope's private chamber. The systematic nature of the theft emerged in Denon's obsessive catalogues. Provenance, condition, scholarly significance. Each stolen masterpiece got its own file, its own justification. The bureaucracy of theft grew as elaborate as the theft itself. But the most damning evidence was what was left behind. Churches displayed pale rectangles where paintings had hung for centuries. Empty pedestals gathered dust where Roman emperors had stood. The systematic liberation had created systematic emptiness, wounds in the cultural fabric that no amount of French cataloguing could heal. July 27th, 1798. Paris dressed itself in triumph for the Festival of Liberty, a celebration of conquest disguised as cultural enlightenment. The weather cooperated. Crystal blue skies, sunlight that turned the Seine to molten gold. Perfect conditions for parading stolen masterpieces through the streets like conquered enemies in a Roman triumph. The procession stretched for miles. First came soldiers, their uniforms dusty from Italian campaigns. Behind them, the wagons, each one a mobile museum. The Venus de Medici rode like an empress on a specially constructed platform, her marble form wrapped in French silk. Women held their daughters up to see her. Men removed their hats. Behind Venus came the paintings, hundreds of them, displayed on specially built frames. Raphaels and Titians and Caravaggios processing through Paris. Each masterpiece bore a placard, freed from the tyranny of private ownership, restored to the people by the armies of the Republic. This wasn't theft. This was democracy in action. The bronze horses of St. Mark pranced through Paris one last time before installation, their ancient bronze gleaming. Venetian émigrés watched from windows, faces careful masks. One old merchant crossed himself as they passed. Whether blessing or curse, no one asked. The Vatican collection merited its own section. The Laocoön writhed in marble agony atop a wagon draped in purple, a deliberate insult to papal authority. Anti-clerical crowds cheered especially loud, seeing in each stolen statue a blow against religious tyranny. Napoleon appeared at the climax, riding a white horse. He'd positioned himself perfectly. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but at the moment of peak enthusiasm. He stopped to address the crowd, his Corsican accent lending exotic flavour to his pronouncements about French cultural destiny. He spoke of Rome, of Athens, of Alexandria, great cities that had gathered the world's knowledge. Now Paris would join them. France hadn't stolen these treasures. France had saved them. The crowds roared approval. After years of revolution and terror, here was something glorious and tangible. You could see a Raphael. You could stand before the Apollo, The Republic might be abstract, but these marbles were real. One voice rose above the celebration, an Italian merchant shouting about theft, about cultural murder. The crowd shifted. Dangerous. But Napoleon raised his hand. Let him speak. This was a democracy. The Italian spoke of empty churches, of communities that had lost their spiritual centres when altarpieces were ripped away. He mentioned that taking a city's art was like taking its soul. Napoleon responded with calm certainty. These works belonged not to single cities, but to all humanity. They were imprisoned in darkness. France had brought them to light. They were seen by hundreds. Now they would be seen by millions. As for souls, France was offering something better than provincial spirituality. France was offering enlightenment itself. The crowd cheered. The merchant disappeared into the sea of bodies. The procession continued, unstoppable as historical inevitability. This was the tragedy's heart. The democratic dream was real, built on foundations of theft. The public good genuinely served through private wrongs. Every working-class Parisian who learned to love art in the Musée Napoléon was both beneficiary and unwitting accomplice. They were receiving an education in beauty, subsidized by cultural devastation. Spain was supposed to be different. Spain was an ally. But by 1808, Napoleon's appetite had grown beyond what treaties could contain, and when the Spanish people decided to resist French occupation, they gave him the excuse he'd been waiting for. The Spanish didn't fight like the Italians, who had mostly accepted their fate with resignation. The Spanish fought with a fury that surprised even Napoleon's veterans. They fought in the streets, in the mountains, in their churches. And when the French came for their art, they fought for that too. The Spanish had learned from Italy's example. When French armies approached, local officials organised desperate evacuations. Paintings were cut from frames, rolled up, hidden in wine cellars and mine shafts. Sculptures were buried in monastery gardens. Entire altarpieces disappeared into the countryside, carried by networks of priests and patriots who risked execution to save them. The cat-and-mouse game that followed would have been comic if it weren't so deadly. French patrols searched for hidden art. Spanish guerrillas ambushed convoys. Masterpieces changed hands multiple times. Suffering damage with each transfer, a Velázquez might be hidden in a convent, discovered by French soldiers, stolen by guerrillas, recaptured by French reinforcements, and finally arrive in Paris with knife slashes and water damage, preserved for humanity by being nearly destroyed. Dinon arrived in Madrid appalled by the chaos. This wasn't how cultural liberation was supposed to work. His carefully trained teams were being shot at. The Spanish campaign was turning his orderly museum project into a bloody farce. In Seville, the French found the cathedral's treasury emptied, its precious paintings replaced with copies. The originals had been distributed among 100 local families, each sworn to protect their peace with their lives. French soldiers went door to door searching and found households willing to burn their homes rather than surrender a single saint's portrait. The violence escalated. French soldiers, frustrated by resistance, began destroying what they couldn't steal. If a church's altarpiece was too large to transport, they might slash it out of spite. Cultural appropriation became cultural warfare. Francisco Goya watched it all with eyes that saw too much. His paintings from this period, the ones he didn't show anyone, captured the horror. Not heroic battle scenes, but the aftermath. French soldiers stripping a church while corpses cooled in the plaza outside. Spanish civilians burying paintings in the same graves as their dead. Art and death intertwined in ways that would have seemed blasphemous before the war made blasphemy commonplace. Goya himself became a target. His position as court painter made him valuable. His genius made him irreplaceable. French officials approached him with offers. Come to Paris. Bring your art. Be celebrated as you deserve. They spoke of patronage, of a studio in the Louvre, of his name immortalised alongside the masters whose work now hung in French galleries. Goya responded with silence and increasingly dark paintings. He documented what he saw with the unflinching eye of a man beyond fear, beyond hope, beyond everything but the need to witness. One night in 1810, French soldiers came to confiscate his studio's contents. They had orders, paperwork, the full authority of the occupying government. They expected resistance, perhaps, or resignation. They found neither. Goya was waiting for them. Standing in the centre of his studio, the space was lit by dozens of candles, their flames creating shadows that danced across the walls, and on those walls, on every available surface, hung his work, not his pretty portraits of Spanish nobility, not his royal commissions showing elegant courtiers, not the pleasant images French officials expected to pack up and ship to Paris. Instead, the soldiers found themselves staring at mirrors of their own monstrosity. The disasters of war covered the walls, etching after etching showing the Peninsular War in all its horror. French soldiers executing Spanish civilians, bodies piled in ditches, women and children fleeing burning villages, priests hung from trees, and in every image, the same relentless documentation of what enlightened France had brought to Spain. But it was the paintings, the ones Goya called his black paintings, though he hadn't named them yet, that froze the soldiers where they stood. Saturn devouring his son, the god's eyes mad with hunger, witches gathering in darkness, faces twisted with terror or rage or despair. These weren't accusations painted with the distance of allegory. These were raw wounds, still bleeding, too fresh and too true to dismiss. The commanding officer, a lieutenant who'd fought his way through 3 years of Spanish resistance, walked slowly around the studio. He stopped before a particular etching, one showing French soldiers with their backs turned, while behind them, Spanish civilians prepared for execution. The soldiers' faces weren't visible, but their postures showed boredom, routine, the casual indifference of men doing unpleasant work. "This is what you think of us," the lieutenant said quietly. Goya, deaf since his illness years before, couldn't hear the words, but he could read faces, and he understood the question beneath the statement. He picked up a piece of charcoal and wrote on a blank canvas, "This is what you are." The soldiers could have taken everything, could have destroyed it, arrested Goya, sent him to prison or worse. Instead, they looked at the works covering the walls, at their own violence reflected back at them with such brutal clarity that denial became impossible, and they left. They walked out of that studio with empty hands and full hearts, unable to steal mirrors of their own monstrosity. The story spread among the French forces. Some dismissed it as propaganda. Others began to understand what they'd become in the name of cultural enlightenment. A few deserted, unable to reconcile the gap between Napoleon's promises and the reality they lived every day. Most just kept fighting, kept confiscating, kept telling themselves that the end justified the means. But they avoided Goya's studio after that, and when Denon himself visited Spain later that year, he made a point of not seeking out the artist. Some truths are too dangerous to confront. The Spanish campaign became Napoleon's cultural Vietnam. Every convoy that reached Paris carried damaged goods and blood-soaked provenance. The Musée Napoléon filled with wounded paintings, canvases with sabre slashes, statues missing limbs from gunfire. Denon tried to maintain his scholarly detachment, but the justifications grew thinner. How do you explain the cultural significance of a Murillo when it arrived with bullet holes? How do you celebrate preserving a masterpiece when the monastery that housed it no longer existed? The irony was sharp. The nation that resisted most fiercely kept most of its treasures. The nation that fought for every painting proved that art truly was worth fighting for. Spain's fury validated Napoleon's thesis, that art mattered supremely, while destroying his method of proving it. By 1813, as French forces retreated, They left behind more than military defeat. The Spanish had shown that masterpieces weren't just beautiful objects, but pieces of the national soul. Take them, and you took something essential. The Spanish campaign had transformed Napoleon's museum project from controversial to criminal in the eyes of Europe. The man who claimed to be saving culture had shown himself willing to destroy it when thwarted. June 18th, 1815, Waterloo. Where Napoleon's empire died in Belgian mud and British artillery. But the victors didn't just want French territory or gold, they wanted their paintings back. The Allied armies entered Paris with remarkable restraint. No looting, no burning. They had something more precise in mind. Wellington himself took personal charge of what he called the restitution question. His approach was methodical and absolutely merciless. Every stolen artwork would be returned. Every single one. The French government tried negotiation. They argued preservation. Hadn't the Louvre protected these works? They argued scholarship. They argued public good. They argued everything except the one point that mattered. The art wasn't theirs to keep. Wellington listened, then produced lists. Detailed, comprehensive lists compiled by the Allies over years. Every painting, every statue, every artifact catalogued with its origin. The French had been meticulous in their theft. The Allies were equally meticulous in their reclamation. Foreign commissioners arrived daily. Italian delegates with inventories dating back to 1796. Spanish representatives seeking scattered treasures. Vatican officials with papal authority and righteous fury. Every nation Napoleon had culturally colonized sent representatives to reclaim their patrimony. Denon fought every removal with desperate energy. He produced documentation showing how carefully each piece had been preserved. He pointed out restorations. He argued, pleaded, occasionally wept. But the commissioners were immune to his pain. The first major removal was symbolic. The horses of St. Mark's. The same bronze steeds that had pranced through Paris in the Festival of Liberty would return to Venice. Denon supervised their descent from the Arc de Triomphe personally, his aged hands shaking. An Austrian officer offered cold comfort. They survived for 2,000 years before you saved them. They'll survive another 2,000 back where they belong. Denon had no answer. The Locan left next. The Vatican collection followed. Priests came to reclaim sacred art torn from sacred spaces, treating each recovered painting like a rescued prisoner of war. The French public's reaction split violently. Some accepted defeat with the bitter grace of those who'd seen empires rise and fall before. Others raged at the injustice. Hadn't France earned these treasures through victory? Hadn't French appreciation, French scholarship, French conservation justified possession? Protests erupted, not violent. The Allied armies were too present for that, but passionate. Students chained themselves to statues, declaring they be removed along with the marble if necessary. Artists organised sit-ins around paintings, sketching frantically as if they could preserve the works through memory if not through possession. The Latin Quarter became a staging ground for cultural resistance. Young people who'd grown up visiting the Louvre for free now facing its systematic emptying. One memorable morning in September 1815, officials arrived to remove a Raphael Madonna, one of the most beloved pieces in the collection. They found 100 French women kneeling before it, rosaries in hand, praying for the Virgin to remain in France. The women ranged from washerwomen to minor nobility, united in their conviction that this was sacrilege, that removing holy images was a crime against God himself. The Allied soldiers, many of them Catholic, hesitated. They'd been prepared for political protests, not religious ones. A standoff developed, with the women refusing to move and the soldiers unwilling to drag them away from prayer. Wellington had to intervene personally, arriving at the Louvre to explain, with surprising gentleness, that God probably preferred his art in its original churches, where it had been created to inspire worship. not in a converted palace where it served as entertainment. The women left, but not before one elderly Parisienne turned to Wellington and said, "You will take our beauty, but you cannot take what it taught us, that we are worthy of such things. You think we will forget, but we won't." She was right, though it would take another revolution to prove it. Napoleon, imprisoned on Elba, received reports of his museum's dissolution. His responses, smuggled out by sympathizers, revealed a man unable to accept the judgment of history. He still believed, still insisted he'd been civilization's savior, not its thief. Still maintained that concentrating humanity's treasures in Paris had been visionary, not criminal. The true believers are always the last to lose faith, but the most revealing reactions came from the collaborators, the men who'd believed Napoleon's vision enough to betray their own nations for it. They emerged from the shadows as the restitution proceeded. These scholars and experts who'd helped identify treasures for removal, Italian art historians who'd walked French commissioners through Florentine galleries, pointing out which Botticellis were most significant, Spanish curators who'd provided inventories of monastery collections, thinking they were serving scholarship rather than conquest, German antiquarians who'd authenticated pieces for transport to Paris, convinced they were participating in the democratization of culture. Now they faced the reckoning. Some were exiled by their returning governments, declared traitors to national patrimony. An Italian scholar who'd helped catalogue the Vatican removals found himself banned from ever again entering a Roman church. A Spanish librarian who'd facilitated the removal of illuminated manuscripts was stripped of his position and pension, dying in poverty while the books he'd helped steal returned to Spain. Others faced social ostracism more brutal than any legal punishment. They became pariahs in their own cities, their former colleagues crossing the street to avoid them. Invitations stopped arriving. Publications stopped accepting their work. Their names became shorthand for collaboration, for the particular shame of selling out one's cultural heritage for the promise of enlightenment that never arrived. One Italian curator who'd worked closely with Denon wrote a public confession that circulated through European newspapers. "I told myself I was serving art, serving scholarship, serving humanity. I see now I was serving empire dressed in philosophy's clothes. Every masterpiece I helped remove was a betrayal of the communities who'd preserved them for centuries. Every catalogue I compiled was a crime against my own nation. I ask forgiveness from God and Italy, knowing I deserve neither. Let my shame be a warning to others. There is no noble cause that justifies stealing a people's soul." The confession changed nothing for him. He died in obscurity 3 years later, but it captured the collaborators' tragedy. These weren't villains. They were believers who'd chosen the wrong faith. They genuinely thought they were building something better, that centralizing art in Paris would serve human progress. They'd convinced themselves that national boundaries were artificial constructs that true culture transcended. They discovered, too late, that nations and communities have claims that abstractions can't erase, that taking a church's altarpiece doesn't just move an object, it breaks a connection between people and their past, that serving a grand vision often means betraying particular human beings with names and faces and losses that can't be philosophized away. The collaborators had been Napoleon and Denon's most useful tools, local experts who made the systematic theft possible. Now they were discarded, abandoned by the French who'd used them and rejected by the nations they'd betrayed. They fell through the gap between empires, belonging nowhere, remembered only as cautionary tales about the price of believing someone else's paradise. The removals continued through autumn 1815. Crowds gathered to watch their Raphaels leave, their Titians depart, their marbles begin the long journey home. Some wept, others stood in bitter silence. The Louvre's galleries began showing gaps like missing teeth. Walls that had displayed masterpieces now showed discoloured rectangles. The museum that claimed to preserve everything for humanity was becoming a monument to absence. Denon tried one last gambit. Some pieces, he argued, were too fragile to travel. Others had been so extensively restored by French experts that they were essentially new works. Still others had unclear provenance, claimed by multiple nations or none. Surely these, at least, could remain. Wellington, to his credit, considered each case individually. A few pieces, genuinely too fragile or genuinely unclear in origin, were allowed to stay, but only a few. Then came the discovery that would forever taint Denon's reputation: the secret warehouses, acting on tips from French workers, some motivated by conscience, others by the promise of Allied gold. Search parties found caches of art Denon had hidden throughout Paris. A government warehouse near the Seine held dozens of paintings wrapped in oilcloth. An unused apartment in the Marais concealed sculptures small enough to transport but too valuable to risk. A storage room in Denon's own residence revealed the worst: a private collection of rescued masterpieces that had never made it to the public galleries. The revelation destroyed any remaining sympathy for Denon's position. He'd presented himself as culture's selfless servant, working tirelessly to preserve beauty for all humanity. He'd given speeches about democratizing access to art. He'd written treatises on the moral obligation to share civilization's achievements with the masses, all while hoarding masterpieces like a miser, squirreling away the best pieces for his private enjoyment. The scholar thief had been hedging his bets, keeping a personal insurance policy against exactly this disaster. The democratic ideals he'd preached applied to everyone but himself. Every tear he'd shed for the departing artworks became suspect. Had he been mourning for humanity's loss, or for his own? Wellington ordered every hidden piece returned to its rightful nation. The search expanded, with Allied teams methodically going through every government building, every administrator's residence, every location that might have served as a hiding place. They found more than anyone expected, not just Denon's hoard, but similar caches kept by other officials, each one thinking they were clever, each one caught in the same trap of believing their own justifications. Denon wasn't arrested. The Allies had bigger concerns than one elderly curator, but he was finished. His reputation, built over decades of careful cultivation, crumbled overnight. The great democratizer of art stood revealed as another greedy collector, his high ideals just prettier justification for common theft. Former colleagues avoided him in the street. His scholarly publications were suddenly unavailable in bookstores. His name became a cautionary tale about the corruption that lurks beneath every noble cause. The final tally was damning. Thousands returned to Italy, hundreds to Spain. The Vatican collections largely reconstructed. German and Austrian treasures restored. The greatest gathering of art in human history dispersed as quickly as it had assembled. But not everything left. Some pieces remained. Their origins too murky or their condition too fragile. Some nations, exhausted by war, didn't pursue every claim. The Louvre retained enough to remain a great museum, built on foundations part donation, part purchase, and part theft so old it had been laundered by time. St. Helena, 1816, a volcanic rock in the South Atlantic where the man who'd conquered Europe spent his final years with nothing but memories. Napoleon's last prison came without bars, just an ocean of irrelevance, but in his mind. The galleries remained full. During long evenings, Napoleon would describe the Louvre to anyone who'd listen, walking them through phantom galleries, describing vanished masterpieces with perfect recall. His secretary dutifully recorded these reveries. Napoleon's memoirs devoted disproportionate space to the museum project, as if he could rebuild in words what Wellington had dismantled in fact. The justifications came polished by repetition. France had been the only nation capable of properly appreciating humanity's treasures. The revolution had made France the spiritual heir to Athens and Rome. The fact that other nations disagreed merely proved they weren't civilized enough to understand. He spoke often of the Spanish campaign, but never of the blood. In his version, patriots hadn't died protecting their heritage. They'd been misguided provincials resisting progress. The churches burned, the paintings slashed. None of that made it into the Emperor's authorised version. The British governor reported that Napoleon seemed most animated when discussing art. Military defeats could be rationalised, but the museum's dissolution genuinely wounded him. He'd lost battles before. He'd never before lost a vision made manifest. Visitors found themselves subjected to lectures on cultural centralisation. A British admiral expecting to discuss Waterloo received a 3-hour discourse on proper lighting for marble sculptures. The obsession went beyond nostalgia. Napoleon was fighting for his soul's verdict. If the museum project had been theft, then he was a thief. If it had been visionary, then he was a visionary brought low by lesser minds. Servants reported finding Napoleon standing before bare walls, staring at specific spots as if paintings hung there. He'd been observed having one-sided conversations, apparently explaining artistic techniques to invisible students. The man who'd ruled Europe now ruled only his memories. As his health declined, the art obsession intensified. Fever dreams mixed battlefield memories with gallery tours. He'd call for Denon in the night, demanding updates on acquisitions. Unaware his curator was in Paris and his museum dispersed. The past and present blurred. Yet even in decline, the conviction remained absolute. His last coherent statement about the museum, recorded weeks before his death, "I gave Europe a glimpse of what culture could become, unified, accessible, preserved for all humanity. They chose to return to their provincial darkness. History will judge who was right." He died on May 5, 1821, still believing. The last emperor of the French went to his grave convinced he'd been a benefactor betrayed by ungrateful beneficiaries. Denon, now 74 and still defending their shared vision, reportedly wept when the news reached Paris in July. The museum project had been Napoleon's truest self, grandiose, revolutionary, built on foundations of other people's suffering, and justified by appeals to humanity that conveniently excluded anyone who disagreed. Here's what makes this story impossible to resolve cleanly. Napoleon was right about the principle and catastrophically wrong about the method. A public museum, free to all, where working people could experience humanity's greatest achievements. That was genuinely revolutionary. Democratizing access to culture that had been locked behind aristocratic doors for centuries, that mattered. But you can't build paradise on stolen foundations. You can't liberate art through conquest. You can't save civilization by destroying the cultural fabric of nations. The end, no matter how noble, doesn't justify the means, no matter how sophisticated the justification. The Louvre survived, scarred but standing. It reopened with French art and legitimate acquisitions, slowly rebuilding through purchase and donation. The democratic ideal persisted. Free admission, public access, art for all, but now built on honest foundations, mostly. Napoleon's vision of democratized culture was genuinely revolutionary. His method of achieving it was criminal, but when the crime was punished, the vision was punished too. European powers returned to their old ways, many locking recovered treasures back in private collections. The democratic promise Napoleon had proclaimed, falsely, but proclaimed nonetheless, faded. The people who'd grown used to visiting the Louvre found doors closing again, and that's the final tragedy. The thief had built something beautiful with stolen goods. The victims, recovering their property, locked it away again. The public, briefly elevated, returned to cultural poverty. Everyone was right, everyone was wrong. The art endured, indifferent to the human drama enacted around it. What can we learn from Napoleon's magnificent disaster? Perhaps this: beware anyone who claims they're stealing for the greater good. Beware visions so grand they justify any action. Beware true believers who never doubt their righteousness. Napoleon didn't lie when he said he wanted to save civilization. That's what makes this tragedy instead of just crime. The greatest heist in history wasn't motivated by greed. It was motivated by genuine idealism that couldn't see its own darkness. That's what makes it so dangerous. A simple thief admits they're stealing. A true believer convinces themselves it's liberation. Today, the Louvre still displays some treasures whose journey involved Napoleon's armies. Not many, but enough to remind us that history doesn't provide clean endings. The museum's own wall plaques sometimes acknowledge uncertain provenance, or acquired during the Napoleonic period. Bureaucratic language for stories too complicated to fit on a small card. When you visit museums today, remember this: every great collection has shadows in its history. The question isn't whether the past was perfect. It wasn't. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we pretend the shadows don't exist? Do we return everything and empty the museums? Or do we acknowledge the complicated truth that beauty and theft, preservation and destruction, enlightenment and empire can exist in the same space, the same object, the same human heart? Napoleon died believing he was right. Dinon died defending their vision. The nations whose treasures were stolen never forgot. The working-class Parisians who finally saw a Raphael never knew the full price. And the art itself, the paintings, the sculptures, the ancient bronzes, they survived all of it. The theft, the transport, the wars, the returns, they survived Napoleon's grand vision and its collapse. They survived being prizes, symbols, hostages, and trophies. In the end, they outlasted everyone who fought over them. Maybe that's the real lesson. The art mattered more than any of them realized, and less than Napoleon feared. He wanted immortality through his museum. He got it, but not how he imagined. We remember Napoleon not as the curator who saved civilization, but as the conqueror who tried to steal it. His name survives not as a cultural hero, but as a warning about what happens when someone genuinely believes their cause is so righteous that any action becomes justified. The road to the greatest heist in history was paved with Enlightenment ideals, and Napoleon walked it with absolute conviction, convinced until his last breath that he was the hero of this story. He was wrong, but he was also partially right, and that's the most dangerous kind of wrong there is.